Oh, hello. This is Mark Siegel from Pace Incorporated. The purpose of this video to show you hands-on techniques for the 5 Pace Sensitemp handpieces, which are the 5 tools in the Pace toolbox. This solder pen soldering iron we'll use to do some small surface-mounted component removals and some installations. The Thermo-Tweeze handpiece will be used to remove PLCCs, SIMS-type components, connectors, and other assorted type surface-mounted components. The solder extractor here we'll use to do through-hole desoldering as well as surface mount cleanup and solder bridge cleanup. The Thermopic handpiece here we will use for removal of quad flat packs. And last but not least, the hot air jet, which we'll use for some component installation. Behind me, the Pace Sensitemp power supplies that we'll use to drive these Sensitemp handpieces. This course will primarily concern itself with hands-on techniques, so you can become more familiar with how to be as successful as possible with these handpieces. First, let's go to the table and let's take a look at a few of the supplies that we have here. Here is a ready rack, and the ready rack is utilized to store all the various tips that we'll use for our demonstration. It is a burn-proof rack where I can easily remove and replace tips with this tip tool for easy pickup, installation into the handpiece, and to put back into the rack. We also have here a shocking sponge and a wiping brush, fiberglass type wiping brush, which we will wet in preparation for wiping any contamination or dross off of the tips. We also have an alignment tool for some of our larger tips when we want to actually do alignments, for instance on the Thermo-Tweeze tips. So with all of these ideas in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Here is the first Sensitemp handpiece we'll use, which is the soldering iron. And right now I've got a tip in here that I usually use to do regular types of surface mounted soldering, but we're going to take our tip tool and change to our tunnel tip for our first demonstration. I'll now go in on a close-up, and here is that tunnel tip. This tunnel tip will provide the heating necessary to remove an SOIC type component. Initially, in preparation, we may consider doing some fluxing of these contacts here. However, this is a fairly fresh board, so there's very little oxidation, so it will not be required. The basic preparation for the removal is to take the fiber brush tip and clean the front end of this tunnel tip so we have a nice, clean, shiny surface like this. The next step is to take our solder and tin the tip We are relying on the surface tension of the solder to hold the component on the tip. I might also mention I'm running the temperature of this tip at 600 degrees. So let's now go over. We'll come down lightly over the SOIC, make our contact, make sure we're bottomed out, and once we have a complete melt, as you can see, the surface tension holds the component into place. And now I can easily drop it off on the sponge like this. Let's now go ahead and change this tip for our next demonstration. Let's look at the SOT23 type components. And what I'd like to do for this demonstration is go under the microscope. So let me go ahead and fix this circuit board under the scope where we can get a good view of this. Okay, we're all set with the scope. Now, of course, the first thing we will want to do is wipe clean this tip. And we'll go ahead and add a little bit of solder to the front end of this tip so we have thermal linkage between the tip and the work. Now let's go under the scope.
Have a nice Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Bye-bye. Now we'll come down here and make contact with the solder joints, and we get a lift out. If necessary to do a little cleanup here, we can always add some flux. There we are. Okay. Now let's go and switch this tip again. Put it back in the ready rack. For our next demonstration, we'll use this bifurcated tip. Tighten it up. And this is what it looks like close up. Now, once it's been heated, we'll then go ahead and put tinning on this tip. Matter of fact, we'll actually fill the tip somewhat with solder. Now let's go into the microscope and look at some of these chip parts. Here's a couple. 1, 2, 3. There are removals. I'll then take them back off and drop them on the sponge. Let's now remove this tip. Now let's look at a small quad tip like this one. This tip is designed to work on small quad type parts. So let's go ahead and find one of those. Here we are. In this situation, the same type of technique holds true as what we did with the tunnel tip. We'll go ahead and first clean this tip off so it's nice, bright, and shiny. We'll then go ahead and add solder to the tip. And we'll come down squarely on our component that we need to remove. And there we have the removal. And the surface tension is holding the component on until I wipe it off. Always remember to keep the solder on these tips prior to removing them and putting them back in storage. This way they will last a very, very long time. I'll now go ahead and switch back to our long shot and remove this tip and place it back into the ready rack. Now the next demonstration I would like to perform is the removal of this 52 PLC socket. Now, as you can see, I've already removed the inside frame, which is usually found on this style of socket. I'd now like to show you a technique which I call bridging. I'll go ahead and add a regular style half chisel soldering iron tip here. And I'll first utilize this tip to create what we call a solder bridge. And the solder bridge is just what it's described as. It's a bridging of solder to make contacts all across these leads. This solder bridging will help provide the thermal linkage necessary to move this part very rapidly. One more side to bridge. And there we have it. Let's now pull back and switch our tips from this half chisel tip to the appropriate tip for this socket. Let's now go in for a close-up again, and let's prepare this tip. Here it is. And our preparation will primarily be to take the fiber brush and wipe this tip clean so it can transfer the maximum amount of heat. Let's now move over and go ahead and add this to the socket. Going to kind of plug it in, feeling for the melt. And a couple more seconds here. If we feel like we've got a hanger on her, we can always slide some solder in this way. And there we go. Of course, this is a destructive method on the socket. We wouldn't want to reuse that. Now we'll go ahead and remove this tip. And put it back in our ready rack. Now, of course, what I'll do, I'll go ahead and add our regular half chisel tip back to the soldering iron if we need it for our other demonstrations. I'd like to now add a final demonstration on this soldering iron. Here's the situation where we have a small quad flat pack that has been bonded to the board prior to the soldering process during the manufacturing. And there is a staking compound under here that we have to deal with. So let me now turn back to the table, and I'd like to show you this technique. We will be using this quad tip, however we have a different approach that we must take. We'll get to a close-up here, and what I'd like to do is first take solder and bridge this part. And the reason why we're going to bridge it is because we want to ensure that we have maximum thermal linkage prior to a shearing action that we will perform. So once we're bridged, let's now go ahead and remove this soldering iron tip and put back in the quad tip. We'll go through the same type of preparation here, where we'll first, when the solder becomes molten, we will go ahead and wipe this tip off to make sure it's nice and clean. And then we'll go ahead and add fresh solder to the tip. Now for the demonstration. We'll come down squarely in the same way we did before, but once we feel as though we're floating in a puddle of solder, we want to quickly twist the component to break the bond that's left by this adhesive. And now go ahead and drop the part off. Now I'll go ahead and remove this tip and put it back into the ready rack, and I'll go ahead and put this tip back in. I will be using this soldering iron tip here to do some installations, which we'll perform later in the videotape with the Pace solder pen handpiece. So now we'll put this back into the ready rack, and we'll now switch to our next Sensitemp handpiece, which is the Thermopick, which we'll use to remove quad flat packs. Prior to using the tool, I want to show you 4 basic methods to create a thermal linkage between the tip and the work so you can successfully do the removal of these quad flat packs. So let's go back down on our table here, and what I like to do is find 4 representative quad flat packs that we have here, and I like to perform these 4 preparations a little bit differently. Preparation 1, well, if we go to a tighter shot, will be the making of a solder preform. Here we have a block of the appropriate size, and I'll go ahead and wrap wire solder around this block until I've got a nice square formed, and I'll go ahead and cut that and pull it off, and that's our preform. So let's take our sample 1, and we might go ahead and add a bit of an approved flux to the lead land area, and then go ahead and drop the solder preform around its perimeter like this. In the second case, I would like to use solder paste as a means of creating the thermal linkage between the tip and the work. I'm using a solder paste dispenser in one of our paste units here with foot pedal activation, and I'm going to go ahead and add this paste to the contact area. Now, a third method we'll want to look at, which you have already seen, is basically what we call the Monday morning type technique. Is certainly a foolproof method, and of course you will choose these methods based on the standards and practices of your organization, or you'll choose them based on what is the easiest for the operator to work with. So I will go ahead and bridge these leads. Now in the fourth quad flat pack, basically we're going to use a tin the tip approach. So we'll just put our approved flux on the lead land area like this. Okay, we've got these four representative components all taken care of. Let's now take a closer look at this thermopic handpiece. Here it is. We did connect our vacuum hose to the end here, and we are operating at a temperature of 600 degrees. And I'll give you a close-up. And this tip looks dirty, but it's not. It's actually being protected by solder. And we'll now go ahead and wipe that solder off. One of the main points to keep in mind, other than cleaning properly prior to the removal, is to also look at the fact that the suction cup is within the tip. As a matter of fact, it's adjusted to basically the height of the component. The goal when doing this type of desoldering is make sure that the lead stays in constant contact with the edge of the tip through the removal process. You can adjust that moving this tip in and out by loosening the set screw, or if you look within the instruction manual, there is an adjustment for the pick within the handpiece. Now that we have this tip clean and ready to go, let's do our removals. I first like to remove the solder preform. What we'll do is we do have a finger activation for the vacuum here. So I'm going to come squarely down on the solder preform. When I get the melt, I pull out and I wipe the component I've removed onto the shocking sponge. Now here's the case 2 with the solder paste. We'll come down, we'll receive a melt, and we'll come out with that, and also go ahead and wipe on the sponge. Now one thing interesting before I remove the other two parts is that I can immediately lay my hand right up against the circuit board. There's absolutely no heat generated onto the board for thermal shock. Now here is of course one of the easiest ways to go is when we solder bridge. And what I'll do again is I'll wipe this tip clean so we have a very nice capillary force to pull some of the residual solder off. Of course, any solder that does remain on the board we will remove later with our solder extractor. So here we go. Come down, get the melt, square it up. We're floating in a puddle of solder, and then we're out. And I'll go ahead and wipe it on the sponge again. Now for our final demonstration here on this, I will have to work with the tip vertically like this and actually take some of my solder and add it to the tip. Once I've done that, I'll probably want to go ahead and just for safety turn it over my sponge and go like this just to make sure I don't drip solder. Now that I'm set, let's come in for the close-up here, and I'll now move over to the subject, come down, make contact, and we're out. And then once again wipe the component off on the sponge. So So there we have 4 removals. That gives us a safe and easy way to go. I'll make a couple of recommendations at this point. Number 1, when working with the gull wing type component where you have a lot of surface contact area, any of the 4 methods that I've just shown you can be quite successful. When you move to larger components like the 208 or the 160 or even the 132 bumper pack, there is a stronger capillary force between the leads, and they have a tendency to want to draw the solder up towards the body. So I would recommend that you implement, if necessary, the bridge fill technique for those larger types of components. Also, keep in mind that if you do have staking compounds, like we had in this case here with the small quad, and you may have to do some shearing or twisting of that part to break that final bond, I recommend once again that you employ bridge fill method. Okay, let's now move to our next handpiece. Okay, our next handpiece that I'd like to demonstrate is the thermo-tweeze handpiece. It's right here. The thermo-tweeze is used for basically PLCC and LCC removal, also small chips and all types of various other surface-mounted components. I'd like to give you a basic demonstration, however, for this videotape on several different PLCCs. Now, the first thing we have to do is look at the job we need to have done, and of course here we do have a 68 PLCC that needs to come out. So in preparation for this, I would like to go ahead and install the appropriate size tips, and they're right here. Now when these tips are first installed, they're not aligned. So what we'll have to do is take this alignment tool, put it in between the tips, holding the tweezer tightly, and then tightening the set screws. Like this, and we have an aligned set of tips. Now I'll go ahead and put them back in the rack here for a minute. I might also mention that we have a tip and temperature chart here. And all we need to know is that our tip offset for this 320 tip, which is for the 68 PLCC, is an offset constant of 59 degrees. And I will add that offset constant to my power supply, so the temperature I set of 600 degrees is the temperature I get. If you need further information on this, refer to your instruction manual. Now, we've already seen that there are various techniques to do thermal linkage between the tip and the work. We've looked at solder preform. We've looked at the use of solder paste. We've looked at solder bridging, and we've looked at tinning the tips. For the 68 PLCC I'm about to remove, I prefer to use the bridging method, and here's how it's done. Let's go ahead and get our soldering iron. Of course, we do have our correct tip in there, so I'll now go ahead with a close-up, and we'll go ahead and bridge this part up. Kind of feed the solder in and draw the tip. Of course, it took years of practice to do this. Okay, now that we've got our bridging completed. Let's now go ahead and take a look at our tip on our thermotweeze. Here it is. Let's go ahead and get a close-up. Now this tip has been coated with solder for its protection, but now I'd like to wipe that solder off, and I'll do that by wiping the lower inside edges and the front edge to make sure we have a nice clean and shiny tip in preparation for this removal. Now another thing you might see, this tweezer tweezes, but we may not necessarily want all this tweezing because we may not have the clearance here on this board to do this type of tweezing. So I'm going to take this little thumb screw and I'm going to actually close down this tip, so we're using this tool more like a slip fitting device. So now we can come over to our part, slip fit down over it, get our melt, and now go over and drop that part on the sponge. There is some residual solder there which we'll clean up with our solder extractor in a moment. Now I'll go ahead and remove these tips. I'd like to demonstrate a technique for removing of a smaller PLCC. Go ahead and put these tips back in the ready rack here, which is not in your picture. There we go. I'd like to now install the tips to remove a 28 PLCC. Now alignment here, you can use the alignment tool this way, or what I find comfortable, vertically like this, kiss the tips together and tighten the tips like this. Okay. Now I'm going to put this over here for a while. Now I will reduce our offset. You can refer to the offset guide if you need it. I usually just eyeball it. If your requirements are more exact tip temperature, you certainly can use the tip temperature offset chart. I'm just going to go back to a temperature of 600 because there's probably only about a 10-15 degree offset on those tips. Now let's look at our work again. Here's some 28s that need to come out. And what I like to do is prepare those in a couple of different ways. In this one here, I would like to employ the use of that solder paste. So I'll go ahead and turn on my dispenser and add the appropriate amount of paste. In this second case, we'll tin the tips. So let's do case number one. Now, once again, we don't want full tweezing. We want to close it down somewhat and slip fit and square up with this part. And we'll have to wait momentarily as the solder paste melts and pulls in. We then go ahead and we have our removal. And I'll go ahead and pop this on the sponge. Now, in our second case here, I will just do some tip tinning. We may also want to add a little flux excuse me, to this tip, to this joint area. So we'll do that. And now over the sponge, we will add solder to our lower inside and edge of the tip. Once again, I'll close the tweezer so it's more of a slip fitting type action. Come over the part, slide down on it, feel, use tactile feel to feel the release and slide off. And now I'll add this part down onto our sponge. So there are some of the techniques for removing PLCCs. I'll go ahead and remove these 28 PLCC tips. And I'd like now to bring in another subject here, and that is a circuit board that I have laying in front of me. And this circuit board does have some of these SIMS type components on them. And we do have a special set of tips for them, which I'd like to show now. Go back to our long shot, and I'll go ahead and remove these tips and add them to the handpiece. Now, because these tips do not meet when you close them together, you need to align them in a special way. And here's how we can do it. We will take an extra tip tool like this, and we'll put them in between these two tips so we can ensure that these tips are parallel. Now that they're parallel, I will go ahead and tighten the set screw. And you have a nice set of parallel SIMS tips. Give you a close-up on that. There you are. Now for this removal, I will go ahead and tin the tips. We could choose to use bridging here if we wanted to, but I'll just go ahead over the sponge. Let's get these parts off of here. I'll go ahead and put tinning on these tips. Once again, I'll turn the tips upside down on the sponge just to make sure I can avoid any dripping. Now I'll come over and we'll go ahead and slide down onto where the part is. We get our melt and we're out. And I did just drop the component on the sponge. There is some residual solder there. We might be able to grab some of it with the tip here, but of course we're going to clean it up later with the extractor. Now I'll go ahead and remove these tips and put them back in the ready rack. Just to mention, for tips that, for SIMS components that are very tightly spaced, soldering iron tip like this to go on the top and put the heat in through the leads as a means of removal and slide off with this little paddle on the end of the tip. I'd also like to mention that there are various other types of chip tips and tips for connectors that can be utilized with a thermo tweezer, which we may eventually add into this videotape. But that's basic instruction on how to use the thermo tweeze. Let's now move to our next handpiece, and this handpiece is the paste solder extractor. And we have a tip right in here right now for... I'm going to remove this tip, and I would like to introduce you to the flow desoldering tip. And here it is. This flattened tip will enable us to remove surface solder from the areas which we have desoldered. Let's look at some of these. Here's where we did the SOIC removal, and there is some residual solder there. Here are our removals with a thermopick. We have residual solder. Let's go ahead and clean those up now. The basic technique is to come in, get a melt, move back and forth, and vacuum. This is such an excellent method for doing this type of work that I think it would be appropriate that we did this under the microscope. So I'll go ahead and get this in position. And let's see what we got on the scope. Okay, here's some of the residual solder that was left. Let's now take the flow desoldering tip, come down, get a melt, and vacuum it up. This is the washboard technique. Another technique that you could employ is kind of a go with the grain technique like this, or a combination of both is preferred. Kind of a circular motion. Here's the PLCCs we had removed. Here. And here's the other quad flat pack. Now if we go ahead and clean these up, we can see how good they're going to look. A little bit of solvent. Approved cleaners, should say. And there are the results. The solder extractor certainly can also be used for through-hole desoldering. So what I'd like to do is come over here and let's change our tip. And go with our solder extractor tip here, a thermodrive tip. And now I'd like to position the microscope with its board so we can demonstrate this desoldering. I'll use a work holding device. Move the scope up here. That's it. And I'll go ahead and add this board. Okay, it looks like our board is in place here. However, I've noticed that right here it looks as though we have insufficient solder at that joint. So I'm going to go ahead and add some solder there so we have a proper fillet, so as to have the proper thermal linkage to do the desoldering. Okay. I'm now going to go ahead and take the solder extractor and come down on the joint, get a melt, floating in the molten solder. We're going to lead and vacuuming the solder out of the hole. Let me give you a little bit more of a angle like this, which will help to better visualize what is actually going on here. I'm coming down on the joint. I'm riding on the puddle of molten solder, and I'm wiggling the lead. After I've removed the solder, I continue to wiggle the lead and pull the high velocity of air through the board, cooling the plated through hole and the component lead below solder melt temperature. And in this way, I can eliminate the resweat problem. Now, you may not understand what the resweat problem is, so let me stop here for a second and explain that. A lot of times, after you've desoldered a circuit board, you might usually take a chain nose pair of pliers and go ahead and go like this. Now, what's that doing? You're breaking the sweat joints. So if you are doing that type of action, you might try to wiggle the lead and give a good full melt and vacuum out the solder. But as you're vacuuming, keep the lead wiggling. Let's try that again. I'll go back and reposition this. Also, if we work vertically like this, I've already done those. If we work vertically, we're better able to see the melt of the solder on the opposite side. As you can see there where my finger is. Now I'd like to angle this board a little bit to do the opposite side so you can get a good visual. Okay, let's now do the opposite side. Come down, melt the solder, wiggle the lead. Oops. Vacuum it out. Floating on the molten solder. I'm really not scrubbing the pad. And one more joint here in the end. And there's our removal. We loosen this. And there's the removal of that part. Should come out with your hands. There you are. Okay. Now that's the desoldering at its simplest. Now let's say, for instance, we might have a large ground plane on this side, but we only have an isolated land on this side. How would we deal with something like that without turning up the temperature? We can employ auxiliary heating because the fear is that we'll lift this isolated land here before we ever get a melt of a large ground plane on the opposite side. And if we turn up the temperature to try to overdrive this big mass on this side, we may end up lifting the isolated land on this side. So we'll employ auxiliary heating. And auxiliary heating, to put quite simply, is combining the soldering iron in your opposite hand, which would touch the solder joint on the component side, followed by the solder extractor on the lead termination side. Let's switch back to the microscope and I'll show you how that works. Basically, you're going to come down with the soldering iron on this solder joint, followed by the solder extractor on this side. Once you have a full melt and lead wiggling, you hit the vacuum, vacuuming and cooling, and remove the soldering iron. And that's how you would get around very, very large multi-layer boards that had extreme ground planes and you wanted to still work at 600 degrees or 650 degrees. It's a good way to do it. I'd like to now turn our attention to a couple of other things that we can do with the solder extractor. I'd like to offer a demonstration first of terminals. Now here's a turret terminal here that needs to be removed. And let me fix this and get it in focus. There we are. Now the idea is to fully melt the solder and extract it. That lighting looks pretty good. So what we're going to do is take a little bit of solder wire and get it ready. Because what I'm going to actually do is come in with the extractor. I'll tin the extractor tip, come onto that connector, or that turret terminal, use the solder to help thermally link the tip to the work. Once we get our melt, we vacuum, wiggle our wire, and slide it off like this. Let's now switch to another type of terminal. This pierced type terminal. Go ahead and put this in the work holding device. And in this case, we're going to follow the same type of rule. We're going to take some solder to help us thermally link the tip to the work. We're at a very low temperature, 600 degrees. Link that tip up. We get our melt, vacuum the solder off the terminal, and remove the wire. So as you can see, there's quite a few applications that you can do with the solder extractor. We've seen through-hole desoldering, we've seen terminal desoldering, we've seen pierce terminal desoldering, we've also seen surface desoldering with the flow desoldering tip. And now I'd like to give you a final demonstration, and I'd like to use a very special tip. If we can go back down here to our ready rack. Let's even get a close-up of this. We have what we call an adapt tip here. And this adapter tip is holding a curved style micro tip from Pace. And I'd like to go ahead and install that in the extractor using the tip tool. And I'll show you a method that we can use for debridging. Many times we have products that are coming off the production line, or even when we're doing hand soldering, if we inadvertently have a bridge, we may want to remove it. And the best way to demonstrate that is under the microscope. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this area. Go ahead and lower the scope and get a fine pitch component. Now, of course, I don't have a bridge there right now, but let's go ahead and add a bridge to this 20 mil part. Like this. Now, for doing this debridging work, we may first want to come in and add a light additional flux, and then come in with the solder extractor, get a complete melt, and vacuum off the bridge. And of course, this is just something else you can do with this solder extractor. Okay? Okay, for our last handpiece, we're going to look at the thermojet. And the thermojet I'll be using for installing small chip resistors. It could also be used for capacitors. And any place where you have an access problem or a handling problem. We'll also finish this demonstration with installation of all of the different styles of surface mounted components, either with the soldering iron, the solder pen by Pace, or the solder or the hot air jet here. Let's go into the scope. For the first demonstration, I like to show you how to install basic chips. In this area here, we'll go ahead and dispense some solder paste. Now, if you dispense too much like I just did there, you may want to come in with the solder extractor immediately and get that out of there. And go ahead and reinstall the appropriate amount. Now we'll go ahead with a tweezer. We'll place the parts. There's one, and there's two. Now, due to the fact that these are small components, with our hot air jet attached to the pressure, we may want to go to a minimum pressure setting, 0 to 1. And in this way, when we turn on the hot air to the subject, it will not be blown away. As you can see, the paste is warming up. And we'll go ahead and ramp it up a little bit, and then ultimately we'll get the melt. And you can see the surface tension self-aligns the component. Now, let's say we want to work a little bit faster. In this case, if we do want to go faster, we can go ahead and put the pressure up to 3 to 4. But because we might inadvertently blow this away, we either have to keep our distance, or in this case, I'm going to add a little support tool behind. However, once the solder is melted, you can see the surface tension does hold it into place. Let's now take a look at the installation of a quad flat pack using solder paste. I'll go ahead and place the part. We don't have to be so critical as to our placement at this point. All we want to do is get it in a basic position so I can at least flux these opposite corners and tack the part in. Take my soldering iron and wipe it clean and get a tack in there and a tack in over here. Now we'll go ahead and dispense the appropriate amount of solder paste where the toe meets the land and run a bead in this fashion. One more side. Now, before I do this demonstration on this, a lot of folks have asked me about how do I work with this solder paste? What am I looking for? How fast do I put the air? How close do I get with a hot air jet? Well, what I'd like to do is have you set it at about 3 to 4. We're going to play a little game called air hockey puck solder ball. And the game is played by first putting air and getting the solder paste to slump. And see, it was basically heated and it slumped down. Now the idea is to continue to heat it in a slow fashion to go from a shiny surface to more of a flat looking finish. As you can see, it's changing, and ultimately the solder coalesces. Now you want to try to get it to coalesce into one ball, and you want to be able to blow that ball around just slightly, but you don't want to push it away. Alright, and that's solder ball hockey. And as you can see, there is one single ball of solder. Now let's apply that to this piece here. We're going to go up and back with this flattened type tip. We're going to be warming the solder paste, there it slumps, but we're also warming the leads as well. Once we have a dry look to the solder paste, we'll go ahead and start at this end and draw up, heating the leads and the paste. And that solder paste will draw from the toe to the heel fillet. And we'll go back and forth and do that again here. Of course, if you are working on a high mass board, you might consider the use of preheating as a means of doing this type of installation. You also want to make sure your circuit board is dry so you do not have any problems with the moisture outgassing through the solder paste. And there's our final run. Now I'd like to show you the same component being installed with a soldering iron technique. Let's go back to the microscope. Let's go over here and grab a part. And we'll put it in a position. Once again, like we did with the solder paste procedure, we will have to go and flux opposite corners here so we can tack and align the part. And here we go here and here. Now what I'd like to do is use this no clean flux and add it to the lead land area. Now once I've done that, I'll take the soldering iron, I'll wipe the tip real well, and I'll actually add a meniscus of solder to the face here. Now I'll bring that meniscus down onto the lead land and I'll draw across like this and draw across like this. What's happening is that solder on the bottom of that tip is making contact slightly with the lead and creating the solder joints. So there's another way to do it. Let's now look at a installation of a socket. Here's a PLCC 52 area for a socket, and here's the socket that I'm going to be using. Here, let's go out here on the camera and this thing. Now with this type of socket, certainly you could leave this frame in here and solder it by hand point by point, but if you want to do a faster job of it, you can punch this frame out of here so you have something like this. Of course, you might need to take a tweezer and remove a few of these little pieces, and that's good. So let's go back under the scope, and now what I'd like to do is pre-fill opposite corners, once here and once over here. Now I'll go ahead and wipe my iron again, and I'll tack this socket into place. Align it up here, and then on the other side, tack it in. If there was a little stress created, we certainly can alleviate that by reflowing this opposite side again. There we go. Now, basically, we'll now want to go ahead and flux, and I'll use this no clean formula, fluxing the lead land areas. Being careful not to put any flux on the contact area where the component is to be put in. And now, like you saw before, actually going to take our soldering iron and add this meniscus to it, and go ahead and start on this side, come towards the middle, and then start back on the left, and then back to the middle. And that's how we get our fillets. Two more sides. Add a little more solder here. And the last side. Okay. So that's a technique for doing the socket. Now, certainly if you have a fixed bottom on the socket, you may have to resort to a fine needle type tip and go point by point by point. Let's now go to a 160 quad flat pack, which is right here next to my socket. Of course, after the lead lands have been thoroughly cleaned, you will go ahead and place the part on the lead land area. Now we'll have to tack it in. So I'll add flux to the opposite two corners. And now I'll tack in. Once there, and once here. And now I'm just checking to make sure the alignment is good, which it is. Now, looks like I might have an access problem here, so I'm going to just do these three sides, and then I'll show you another method with that fourth side. On the three sides that I think I have access to, I will just go ahead and flux these areas. And now I'll go ahead, after wiping the tip clean, so it's shocked nice and fresh, I'll add a meniscus of solder here. And now I'll start at this point, and I'll draw the tip across. And as I move along, the solder joints are created. And here's the final side. I'll draw this way. And very nice solder joints. Now, once again, as I said here, I may not risk that because the heater's too close and these kind of elements. I may want to revert and move to a solder paste because I can get in there with this needle. So I'm going to go ahead and dispense solder paste down here. Now, of course, usually when I work with the solder paste, I always have this solder extractor tip ready because sometimes, you know, I'm human, I can get a solder bridge like anyone else. So now let's go on with the paste. We're going to pre-warm the paste. And now we're going to go ahead and do our soldering. Heating the leads and the lands, and the solder paste as molten is being drawn up to create the joints. And that's that type of installation. Let's now move to another very interesting part, and that part would be the PLCC. Now I guess I'm going to have to find a PLCC part. So just a moment, please. Let's switch back to the microscope for a second. And we'll do this area right here. Okay, I've got the 68 PLCC. The first thing we'll do, however, though, is prepare this land area. And we'll do it by just pre-filling opposite corners so we can tack the part in. There's side corner 1. And here's a second corner on the opposite side. And now we'll take the part and we'll go ahead and tack this in. I'll wipe the iron clean. We want to get in here and square up the part and tack it into place. And let's make sure that it's square. It probably shifted a little bit, so let's just correct it like this. And we've alleviated any stress. Okay, we're tacked in. Now what I'd like to do is prop this board up and let's refocus, and I'll show you how this works. We're going to now take some flux and we're going to prepare the lead and lands with flux on all four sides. Okay. Now I'll prop this one up so you get an excellent view, and then I'll put it down on the table to do the other three sides. So we're just going to go ahead and pre-fill once again, and it has to be done experimentally to get the right amount that looks good. We come down in the crease and then draw along, and we create our solder fillets in this way. Great. Now another way you can do this, you don't have to go from the side. You can also go top down where you don't have access. You can kind of come in at this angle. So I'd like to do that now for you. And let's take a look at those. Actually, they look pretty good. One there. Alright. Once again, we'll go ahead and draw, load the tip, and draw across. And as you can see with this method, you can get excellent results. Now I'd like to do a final type demonstration for you, and it is on a 208 quad flat pack. Now I'm not going to use solder paste on this method, and I'm not going to use a mini wave or dragging type technique that you saw me use on these sockets and on the 160. I'd like to show you a method where I actually add solder first to the board and then finish with a hot air jet. And that'll be my final demonstration. I am going to turn the soldering iron temperature down to about 520 degrees, and the reason why is I want to dispense more solder on these lead land areas. So what I'm going to first do on this 208 area is go ahead and flux and once I've fluxed the lead land, the land area here with my low temperature soldering iron, I'm actually going to go ahead and add solder to the tip and then kind of move across like this and add solder to the area. Of course, once you have this, you may want to give it a slight bit of cleaning. A little compressed air helps to dry that off. Now I'm going to go ahead and place the part. Let's get a good 208 part and give it a basic position. We don't have to get it perfect at this point, but what we will do is once we're in this basic position, we like to take some of our flux and add it to about 3 to 5 lead lands there. Also in the middle, this is all on tack side 1, then on tack side 2 about 3 to 5 there, and then 3 or 5 in the middle of tack side 2. We're now going to take our hot air jet at a maximum pressure, and with our very carefully we're going to square up this part. Let's get in the camera here a little bit. I'm going to square up the part, and I'm going to go ahead and put a slight tension tack of 4 to 5 leads on that corner. I'm then going to swing around the opposite side, and once I've got these leads riding on the top of these little solder mounds, I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of tension and tack 4 to 5 leads on the opposite side. I'm then going to move to the middle of the body of tack side 2 and put a slight amount of pressure and put those down as well. Now I'm going to come back to tack side 1 and do the same thing in the middle of the body on tack side 1. Essentially what I've done here, folks, is I'm given tension tacking to hold the tack side down. Now we'll go to the non-tack sides and thoroughly flux them. And we'll also thoroughly flux the tack sides because we have to reflow them too. So now on the non-tack sides, we'll go ahead and melt that solder, and you can see that the leads fall into the meniscus, the molten meniscus of solder. And that's the non-tack side 1, and here's the other non-tack side here. And now we'll go to the tack sides and redo those and reflow our tacks. And now to finish up tack side 1. Now if we cleaned and inspected, we would find that we have a very good result in the leads being down. I hope that some of the techniques that you've seen here help support your use of the Pace Sensitemp hand pieces. They are the 5 hand pieces in the Pace toolbox. And thank you very much for your attentions. Good day.